The laugh wasn't just a sound, it was a verdict. In the suffocating silence of Courtroom 4B, Judge Arthur Harrington leaned back, his face flush with amusement, and aimed his ridicule like a weapon at the boy standing before him. 17-year-old Jamal Hayes, swallowed by a borrowed blazer, felt the laughter land like a physical blow. He was a stereotype on trial, a foregone conclusion in the eyes of a powerful man. The judge saw a delinquent. The prosecutor saw an easy win. What none of them saw was the mind of a legal scholar about to be unleashed. The courtroom thought the case was a joke. They had no idea the punchline was about to bring the whole system to its knees. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the judge's mocking laughter. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second. The image of his little sister, Maya, her face streaked with tears, flashing behind his eyelids. For her, he thought. Stay calm. For her, he was here because of a lie. A clean, simple, and devastatingly effective lie. He'd been at a protest, a peaceful march in downtown Atlanta, organized by high school students demanding better funding for public schools. It was the kind of thing his mother, a history teacher, had always encouraged. "Your voice matters, Jamal," she'd say. "Don't ever let anyone tell you it doesn't." But on that humid Georgia afternoon, his voice had been drowned out by chaos. A small group, not affiliated with the student organizers, had started smashing windows at a high-end boutique on Peachtree Street. In the ensuing panic, the Atlanta Police Department had moved in, batons swinging. Jamal had been trying to pull a younger student out of the path of a surging crowd when an officer grabbed him from behind. The officer's body camera would have shown him helping, but the official report told a different story. Resisting arrest, inciting a riot, vandalism. His public defender, a tired-looking man named Mr. Chen, had met with him for a total of 15 minutes. He'd glanced at the police report, sighed, and advised Jamal to take the plea deal. "Look, son," he'd said, not unkindly. "You fit the description. A black kid in a hoodie at a protest that turns violent? This is Judge Harrington. He's not going to see a student council president. He's going to see a threat. The deal is probation and community service. Go to trial, and you're looking at juvenile detention. Maybe even tried as an adult." Jamal had refused. "I didn't do it," he'd insisted, his voice quiet but firm. "I have a right to a trial." Mr. Chen had looked at him with a weary pity that made Jamal's stomach clench. It was the same look he'd seen 100 times, from teachers who were surprised by his high test scores, from store clerks who followed him through the aisles, from neighbors who clutched their purses a little tighter when he walked by. It was the look of low expectations. Now, standing in the cavernous courtroom, he felt that same condescension radiating from Judge Harrington. The judge was a relic from another era, with a shock of white hair, a ruddy complexion, and a portrait on the wall behind him that looked only slightly younger than the man himself. His family had been powerful in Georgia for generations. The Harringtons had courthouses and libraries named after them. They didn't see people like Jamal Hayes. They saw statistics, problems to be managed. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Davies, had just finished her opening statement, painting Jamal as a misguided youth, swept up in anarchist fervor. It was a performance, full of loaded language and dramatic pauses. Mr. Chen's rebuttal had been tepid, a 5-minute mumbling of presumption of innocence and lack of evidence. Then it was the judge's turn to speak. He peered down at Jamal over his gold-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice a low, rumbling drawl that dripped with paternalistic authority. "You stand here accused of serious crimes, crimes that tear at the very fabric of our civil society. You had the opportunity to accept responsibility for your actions, yet you chose to waste the court's valuable time with this charade." He gestured vaguely toward Mr. Chen, who seemed to shrink a little in his chair. "Your counsel advised you well. The state's offer was more than generous. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. But I see what this is. A little performance of defiance. You and your friends think you can disrupt our city, destroy property, and then come in here and play the martyr. Is that it, son? Jamal's jaw tightened. He met the judge's gaze and held it. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He'd spent the last 2 weeks in a juvenile holding facility, a place that smelled of fear and bleach. He'd read every book he could get from the small library, most of them dog-eared legal thrillers. He'd also read something else, the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct, which he'd had his mother print out and bring him. Nothing to say? Judge Harrington pressed, a smirk playing on his lips. Cat got your tongue. Or are you just trying to figure out your next move? Perhaps you're thinking a few months in juvie might give you some street cred. It was then that he laughed. That booming, dismissive laugh. He looked at the prosecutor, who offered a tight, sycophantic smile. He looked at the court reporter, a middle-aged woman who suddenly became very interested in her stenotype machine. The bailiff shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. The courtroom, once a stage for justice, had become a theater of humiliation. Jamal felt a hot surge of anger, but he pushed it down, compressing it into a cold, hard diamond of resolve in his chest. The judge saw a hoodlum, a statistic, a joke. He had no idea who Jamal Hayes really was. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. The laughter died down, but the smirk remained on the judge's face. "All right, Mr. Hayes," the judge said, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "Let's get on with it. Does the defendant have anything to say before we proceed with the state's first witness?" He said it as a formality, a box to be checked before the inevitable conviction. He expected a mumble, a "no, sir," or perhaps a sullen silence. Mr. Chen stood, ready to speak for him. "Your Honor, my client." "I'll speak for myself," Jamal said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere like a scalpel. Mr. Chen stopped, his mouth slightly agape. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow, the smirk deepening into a look of amused curiosity. "Oh," the judge drawled. "The defendant wishes to speak. Very well. Let's hear it. This ought to be good." Jamal took a steadying breath. He let the silence hang for a moment longer, drawing the focus of every person in the room. He wasn't just a black teen in a borrowed blazer anymore. He was the center of this universe. And it was time to change its orbit. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thin and taut. Every eye was on Jamal. Judge Harrington leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of indulgence, a king allowing a court jester a moment on the stage. He steepled his fingers under his chin, a gesture of magnanimous patience that was more insulting than his laughter. Jamal's gaze didn't waver. He didn't look at his public defender, who was now staring at him with a mixture of panic and confusion. He didn't look at the prosecutor, whose smirk had been replaced by a flicker of irritation at the delay. He looked directly at Judge Harrington, not as a child to an elder, not as a defendant to a judge, but as an equal. "Your Honor," Jamal began, and the sound of his own voice, clear and steady, fortified him. It was deeper than most people expected, devoid of the adolescent crackle they might have anticipated. It was a voice honed by years of debate club championships, of leading student government meetings, of speaking to crowds at community rallies. "With all due respect," he continued, his tone perfectly modulated, "I find it necessary to address the palpable and prejudicial atmosphere that has permeated these proceedings from the moment I entered this courtroom." A low murmur rippled through the small public gallery. Mr. Chen took a half-step forward, his hand twitching as if to pull Jamal back, but he stopped himself. Judge Harrington's condescending smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. The phrase, "palpable and prejudicial atmosphere," was not what he had expected. It was legalese. Precise. "Excuse me, young man?" the judge said, his voice losing its syrupy drawl and gaining a harder edge. "Are you making an accusation?" "I am making an observation, Your Honor," Jamal replied calmly. "An observation grounded in the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct, specifically Canon 3, which mandates that a judge shall perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice. This canon further states, and I quote, 'A judge shall not, in the performance of judicial duties, by words or conduct, manifest bias or prejudice, based upon race, sex, religion, national origin, disability, age, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status.'" The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ms. Davies, the prosecutor, straightened in her chair, her legal pad forgotten. This was not the script. Judge Harrington's face began to flush, a tide of angry red creeping up from his starched collar. "Are you attempting to lecture me on judicial ethics, Mr. Hayes? You, a high school student standing trial for inciting a riot? I am attempting to secure my constitutional right to a fair trial, Your Honor." "A right guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "That right is fundamentally undermined when the presiding judge engages in conduct that suggests a predetermined conclusion of guilt." Your laughter, directed at me, a minor defendant moments ago, could be interpreted by any reasonable observer as a manifestation of such bias. It creates an appearance of impropriety that compromises the integrity of this court. The word impropriety hung in the air like a foul odor. It was a direct challenge, not to the man, but to the office. Mr. Chen looked as though he might faint. He had never, in his 20 years of thankless work, seen a defendant do this. He'd seen outbursts, pleas, and tears. He had never seen a surgical dismantling of a judge's authority by a teenager. The judge slammed his hand on his desk, not with the gavel, but with his open palm. The sound cracked through the room. "That is enough. You are verging on contempt of court, Mr. Hayes." "Am I, Your Honor?" Jamal asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. Contempt of court, as defined by Georgia Code paragraph 1514, involves misbehavior so as to obstruct the administration of justice. I am not obstructing justice. I am seeking it. I am respectfully pointing out that judicial temperament is not a suggestion, it is a requirement. In Williams v. State, the Georgia Supreme Court noted that a judge's comments can improperly influence the jury and deprive the defendant of a fair trial. While there is no jury present, the principle of impartiality remains the bedrock of these proceedings. He paused, letting the case citation land. He saw the flicker of recognition, then shock in the prosecutor's eyes. She knew the case. Every lawyer in the state did. The courtroom was frozen. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. This wasn't about a protest or a broken window anymore. This was a battle of wills, a confrontation between established power and an unexpected, formidable intelligence. The power dynamic, so firmly set just minutes before, was beginning to fracture. Judge Harrington stared at Jamal, his mouth a thin, hard line. The folksy, condescending grandfather was gone. In his place was a man whose authority had been publicly and expertly questioned. He was being outmaneuvered, not by a seasoned attorney, but by the very boy he had mocked. The humiliation was a poison seeping into his veins. "Where?" the judge said, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you learn that?" It was a question born of pure, unadulterated shock. He wasn't asking as a judge anymore. He was asking as a man who had just seen a rabbit pull a magician out of a hat. Jamal allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. It was not a smile of arrogance, but of confidence. "I'm a voracious reader, Your Honor, and for the past 2 weeks, I've had nothing but time. But my reading habits are not the issue at hand." He shifted his weight, turning his body slightly to address the entire court. The issue is the motion I now wish to make. Given the court's demonstrated bias, I am formally requesting that Judge Harrington recuse himself from this case, effective immediately, on the grounds that his impartiality might reasonably be questioned, pursuant to Canon Master 1 of the Code of Judicial Conduct. Silence, absolute profound silence. A motion for recusal. It was the nuclear option, an accusation so serious it could derail a judge's career. And it wasn't coming from a lawyer. It was coming from the 17-year-old boy in the borrowed blazer, who was now citing the specific canon and subsection that gave him the right to do it. Mr. Chen sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Ms. Davies was on her feet, sputtering. "Your Honor, this is outrageous! The defendant is not an attorney! He cannot make such a motion!" "On the contrary, Ms. Davies," Jamal said, turning his calm gaze on her. "While it is unusual, a defendant can indeed represent themselves pro se to make specific motions, especially those concerning fundamental rights. More to the point, my official counsel," he nodded briefly toward Mr. Chen, "can formally submit the motion on my behalf, but the grounds for it have been established by what everyone in this room has just witnessed." He looked back at the judge, whose face was now a pale, mottled mask of fury. The laughter was a distant memory. The game was over. A new one had just begun. The term courtroom drama had always seemed like a cliché to Jamal, a fiction for television. But the scene unfolding before him was more intense than anything he had ever seen on a screen. Judge Harrington's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his dais. The prosecutor, Ms. Davies, looked like she had swallowed a wasp, her face a confused knot of anger and professional alarm. And his own public defender, Mr. Chen, was staring at him as if he had just sprouted wings. The motion for recusal hung in the air, a formal declaration of war. It was a procedural move, yes, but it was also a profound accusation. "You are unfit to judge me." "Your motion is denied," Judge Harrington snapped, his voice tight and strained. It was a predictable, defensive reaction, but Jamal had anticipated it. The denial itself was another piece of evidence. A truly impartial judge would have taken the motion under advisement, scheduled a hearing. A panicked one would swat it away like a fly. "May I ask on what grounds the motion is denied, Your Honor?" Jamal asked, his tone one of genuine inquiry. "The grounds are that it is frivolous, insulting, and without merit," the judge thundered. "It is a desperate tactic from a young man who is clearly in over his head. I will not have my integrity questioned by a juvenile delinquent." The label, juvenile delinquent, was a calculated blow, meant to put him back in his place. But Jamal didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor," he said, "a motion is not frivolous simply because the presiding judge disagrees with it. It is frivolous if it lacks an arguable basis in law or fact. I have cited specific conduct, your laughter, and specific legal canons, Canon 3 and 3E. 1. As the basis for my motion. That is, by definition, not frivolous. Your summary denial, without a hearing, could itself be considered grounds for an appeal on the basis of judicial error. Every word was a perfectly placed stone, building a fortress of logic around him. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was an architect of argument. He saw the dawning horror on Harrington's face. This wasn't just a recitation of memorized lines. This was strategy. Jamal understood the system, and he was using its own rules to trap the man in charge. The judge opened his mouth, then closed it. He was cornered. If he continued to argue, he would only prove Jamal's point about his lack of judicial temperament. If he held him in contempt, it would look like retaliation. The entire case was becoming tainted, and he knew it. "Mr. Chen," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, as he turned his glare on the public defender. "Control your client. Now." Mr. Chen rose shakily to his feet. He looked at Jamal, his eyes pleading. "Son, maybe we should—" "With all due respect, Mr. Chen," Jamal cut in, his voice firm but not unkind. "I believe I am handling my own defense adequately at this moment. However, for the sake of formality, I would ask that you please file the written motion for recusal we discussed." Mr. Chen's jaw dropped. We discussed? They hadn't discussed anything. But in that moment, he understood. This was a lifeline. Jamal wasn't just grandstanding. He was giving his own lawyer a role to play, a way to join the fight without having to lead it. He was being handed a script. Swallowing hard, Mr. Chen nodded slowly. "Yes, of course." The motion. It was then that the courtroom doors at the back of the room swung open. The sound made everyone turn. Two figures stood silhouetted against the bright hallway light. A man and a woman, both dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits. They radiated an aura of wealth, power, and absolute, unshakable confidence that made the air in the room feel thin. The woman was tall and striking, her hair pulled back in a severe chignon. The man was broad-shouldered, with silvering temples, and a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than Judge Harrington's car. They walked down the center aisle, their expensive shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. They didn't look at the gallery. They didn't look at the prosecutor. They walked with the silent purpose of apex predators entering a new territory. They stopped just behind the defendant's table. The woman placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership, of protection. "I apologize for our tardiness, Your Honor," she said, her voice a smooth, cool alto that commanded attention. There was traffic on the I-75. "I am Annalise Hayes." She paused, letting her name settle in the room. "And this is my colleague, Marcus Thorne. We are here to formally take over as counsel for my son, Jamal Hayes." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Ms. Davis's face went pale. The name Annalise Hayes was not just known in Atlanta's legal circles. It was legendary. She was a senior partner at King & Spalding, one of the most powerful corporate law firms in the country, a titan of civil litigation who argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. Marcus Thorne was her peer, a famed constitutional lawyer. They were the kind of attorneys who charged thousands of dollars per hour, whose clients were Fortune 500 companies and foreign governments, not teenagers in juvie. Judge Arthur Harrington looked as if he had seen a ghost. He knew Annalise Hayes, not personally, but by reputation. Everyone did. They moved in the same elite Atlanta circles of charity galas and country club fundraisers, but they were from different worlds. His was a world of inherited provincial power. Hers was a world of meritocratic, global influence. "Mrs. Hayes," the judge stammered, his earlier bluster completely gone. He was no longer a king on a throne. He was just a man, a small-town judge, suddenly face-to-face with the legal equivalent of the U.S. Navy. "It's Ms. Hayes, actually," she corrected him smoothly, her eyes like chips of ice. "My son has just informed me," she glanced at a text message on her phone, "that he has made a verbal motion for your recusal. We have the formal petition here." Marcus Thorne stepped forward and placed a thick, leather-bound document on the prosecutor's table with a soft but definitive thud. "Filed with the clerk's office 10 minutes ago," he said, his voice a deep baritone. "Along with a motion for immediate dismissal of all charges for prosecutorial misconduct and lack of evidence. We've also filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Qualifications Commission of Georgia regarding your conduct in this courtroom today. We have a sworn affidavit from a member of the gallery who recorded your unprofessional outburst." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, where a young woman in a blazer was unobtrusively putting her phone away. A law clerk from their firm. She had been there the whole time. The trap had been sprung. It was never just about Jamal's eloquence. This was a coordinated, strategic assault. Annalise Hayes looked at her son, and for the first time, her severe expression softened into one of fierce, undeniable pride. "Jamal, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," he said, his voice quiet again. She squeezed his shoulder. "You did everything right." Then she turned her gaze back to the judge. It was no longer the look of a lawyer to a judge. It was the look of a mother wolf whose cub had been threatened. "Judge Harrington," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "I believe your time on this case, and perhaps on this bench, is over." The courtroom, once Judge Harrington's kingdom, had become his cage. The arrival of Annalise Hayes and Marcus Thorne had fundamentally altered the physics of the room. Power, which had been flowing down from the dais, now emanated from the defendant's table. Mr. Chen, the public defender, had slowly backed away, seating himself in the front row of the gallery, as if he were now a spectator at a master class. He watched, his expression a dazed mix of awe and terror. Judge Harrington stared at the leather-bound motion on the prosecutor's table. It was a physical manifestation of his new reality. It wasn't just a document. It was a weapon, crafted by two of the sharpest legal minds in the country, and it was aimed directly at him. This is an ambush," he sputtered, his face a blotchy canvas of indignation and fear. "This is a perversion of the process." Marcus Thorne stepped forward. He was a physically imposing man, but his power wasn't in his size, it was in his stillness. He moved with the unhurried grace of someone who has never had to rush, who knows that people will wait for him. "Perversion of the process, Your Honor?" Thorne asked, his voice calm and resonant. "Let's talk about the process." The process began when a decorated APD officer, Daniel Miller, a man with 2 excessive force complaints and a history of racial profiling, all conveniently omitted from the discovery provided to Mr. Chen, arrested my client. The process continued when the district attorney's office, specifically Ms. Davies, pushed for riot and vandalism charges despite the complete absence of physical evidence or eyewitness testimony connecting Mr. Hayes to any destructive act. He glanced at Ms. Davies, who flinched as if struck. And the process culminated here, in your courtroom, where you, Your Honor, chose to mock and humiliate a minor defendant rather than preside with the impartiality your office demands. No, Judge, this is not an ambush. This is a correction. Every statement was a blow, backed by facts and precision. Thorne wasn't just making accusations. He was narrating the systemic failure that had brought them all to this room. He had the officer's name. He knew about his record. They hadn't just come to defend Jamal. They had come prepared to prosecute the entire system that had wronged him. Annalise Hayes took over, her focus lasered in on the judge. "The recording of these proceedings, Judge Harrington, is quite clear. Your laughter, your use of terms like juvenile delinquent and charade, your summary denial of a validly raised motion. The Judicial Qualifications Commission will find it very instructive." She let that sink in. The JQC was the body that disciplined and removed judges in Georgia. It was a career-ending threat. "Furthermore," she continued, "we have already spoken with the student Jamal was assisting when he was arrested. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. Her father is David Jenkins, the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She is prepared to testify that Jamal was shielding her from the crowd when he was assaulted and wrongfully arrested by Officer Miller. The AJC is holding the story, pending the outcome of this hearing, as a professional courtesy. A courtesy that is rapidly expiring. The name David Jenkins landed like a grenade. The press, the one entity a public figure like Judge Harrington feared more than the JQC. His private kingdom was about to be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, his folksy, Old South persona stripped away to reveal the bully beneath. Judge Harrington looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for an ally. The bailiff was staring at the floor. The court reporter was typing furiously, documenting his professional demise. Ms. Davies was quietly packing her briefcase, a clear signal of surrender. She wanted no part of the shrapnel that was about to fly. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted. The boy who had been voiceless now had the most powerful advocates in the city speaking for him. The system that had been designed to crush him was now being turned against its own gatekeepers. Jamal watched the scene unfold, a sense of surreal calm washing over him. For weeks, he had felt like a pawn in a game he couldn't control. Now, he saw the full board. His parents had wanted to intervene from the start, to unleash their legal might the moment he was arrested. But Jamal had insisted on a different path. No, he had told them during a hushed phone call from the juvenile detention center. If you show up on day one, they'll see a rich kid with powerful parents. They'll dismiss the case, and nothing will change. The next kid who looks like me, who doesn't have you, will go through the same thing. I have to do this myself first. I need them to show who they are. I need the world to see it. It had been a colossal risk. He had endured the humiliation, the fear, the condescension, all as part of a dangerous strategy. He had studied the law, not just as an academic exercise, but as a weapon of self-defense. He had baited the judge, knowing that a man like Harrington, so steeped in his own privilege and authority, would not be able to resist the urge to punch down. He had counted on the judge's arrogance, and Harrington had delivered. Now, his reinforcements had arrived, exactly as planned. His mother wasn't just his mother. She was his attorney, his advocate, his avenger. Annalise turned back to her son. She straightened the collar of his borrowed blazer, a simple maternal gesture that was also a profound act of reclamation. She was taking back her child from the state that had tried to claim him. "Are you ready for this to be over?" she asked him quietly. He nodded. "I am." She gave him a small, reassuring smile before her face hardened back into a lawyer's mask. She addressed the judge one last time, her voice devoid of any emotion except for a chilling finality. "Judge Harrington, you have two options. You can grant our motion to dismiss all charges with prejudice, effective immediately, or you can deny it, and we will proceed with our complaint to the JQC, a civil rights lawsuit against the Atlanta Police Department, and a defamation suit against you personally. We will also be providing the unedited recording of this hearing to every major news outlet in the country by 5 o'clock. The choice is yours. You have 60 seconds. It wasn't a legal argument. It was an ultimatum. The fortress of law they had built around Jamal was impregnable, and Judge Harrington was trapped inside with them. The clock was ticking. Judge Harrington was a man drowning in silence. The 60 seconds Annalise Hayes had given him stretched into an eternity. Each tick of the large clock on the courtroom wall was a hammer blow against the crumbling facade of his authority. He looked at the faces before him. Jamal, calm and resolute. Annalise, a vision of cold, righteous fury. Marcus Thorne, an immovable object of legal principle. They were not just a family, they were a phalanx. His mind raced, cycling through decades of unchallenged power. He remembered his father, also a judge, telling him, "Arthur, the bench is a throne. You are the king of your courtroom. Your word is law." For 30 years he had believed it. He had wielded his power like a scepter, dispensing judgments, shaping lives, rarely, if ever, facing a true challenge. He'd seen defendants cry, beg, and curse. He had never seen one deconstruct his authority with his own rulebook. The threat of the JQC was real. The press involvement was a nightmare. A personal defamation suit was unthinkable. But it was the recording that terrified him most. His words, his laughter, stripped of the context of his own courtroom where he was king, would sound ugly, biased, and cruel. Because they were. In the harsh, objective light of the outside world, he would be seen for what he was. His gaze fell on Jamal. He saw him properly for the first time. Not as a thug or a delinquent, but as the brilliant, formidable son of Annalise Hayes, a boy who had played him with the skill of a grandmaster, using his own prejudice as a weapon against him. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot coil tightening in his gut. He had been so sure of his power, so secure in his position, that he had become a caricature of himself, and a teenager had called him on it in front of the world. 30 seconds, Marcus Thorne said, his voice a low rumble, not to rush the judge, but to mark the time. Harrington's career was flashing before his eyes. The respectful nods in the courthouse corridors, the invitations to speak at Bar Association dinners, the easy deference he had always commanded. All of it was turning to ash. He had two choices: a quiet, humiliating surrender, or a loud, career-ending inferno. He picked up his gavel. The smooth, polished wood felt alien in his sweaty palm. It was the symbol of his power, the instrument of his will. He looked down at it, then back at Jamal. In the boy's unblinking gaze, he saw not just his own downfall, but the arrival of a new order, one that he did not understand and could not control. With a choked sound that was part sob, part growl, he brought the gavel down on the wooden block. But he didn't just tap it. He slammed it. He slammed it with all the fury, fear, and frustration boiling inside him. Crack! A fissure shot through the head of the gavel. A small piece of the dark wood splintered off and skittered across his desk. The sound was sharp and ugly, a sound of breaking. It was as if the very symbol of his authority had shattered under the weight of his own failure. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Even Annalise and Marcus seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw, visceral display of defeat. Motion to dismiss, Harrington croaked, his voice hoarse. He couldn't look at them. He stared at the broken gavel, a totem of his broken career. All charges are dismissed, with prejudice. With prejudice were the magic words. It meant the charges could never be brought against Jamal again. It was a total, unconditional surrender. "This court is adjourned," he rasped. Then, without another word, he stood up, his robes askew, and fled through the private door behind his bench, a king abdicating his throne. He didn't just leave the courtroom, he ran from it. The moment the door slammed shut, the tension in the room broke. A smattering of applause and relieved murmurs erupted from the public gallery. Ms. Davies, the prosecutor, was already gone, having slipped out unnoticed during the final tense moments. Annalise Hayes wrapped her arms around Jamal, pulling him into a fierce hug. She held him tightly, her composure finally cracking as the pure relief of a mother washed over her. "You were so brave," she whispered into his hair. "I am so proud of you." Jamal hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the past hour drained away, leaving him trembling. He had done it. He had faced the beast and won. He felt his father, for he now saw Marcus Thorne not just as a lawyer, but as the man who had helped raise him, place a heavy, steadying hand on his back. "You changed the world a little bit today, son," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Jamal looked up, his eyes shining. He saw Mr. Chen approaching them slowly, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. "Mr. Hayes." "Jamal," the public defender began, his voice shaky. I have never seen anything like that. I am so sorry. I should have fought harder. I underestimated you." Jamal met the man's gaze. He saw the exhaustion, the burnout, but also a flicker of something new, a spark of rekindled idealism. "You do the best you can with what you have, Mr. Chen," Jamal said, his voice full of an empathy that was far beyond his years. "The system is designed to make you underestimate kids who look like me. Today, we just reminded it that it's wrong." Mr. Chen nodded, unable to speak. As they gathered their things, the young law clerk who had recorded the hearing approached. "Ms. Hayes," she said, holding up her phone, The AJC is on the line. David Jenkins wants a comment. And so does CNN, The Washington Post, and Reuters. The story is already breaking. Annalise looked at Jamal. It's your story, son. What do you want to say? Jamal took a deep breath. He was no longer a defendant. He was a catalyst. The courtroom battle was over, but the real fight, the public one, was just beginning. He walked toward the courtroom doors, his parents flanking him, a new kind of legal trinity. As they pushed the doors open, they were met with the blinding flash of cameras and a sea of reporters. The whispers of Courtroom 4B were about to become a national roar. The glare of the camera flashes was disorienting, a stark contrast to the dim, oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom. Microphones were thrust toward Jamal's face. Voices overlapped, a cacophony of questions. Jamal, what was going through your mind in there? Ms. Hayes, is it true you're filing a complaint against Judge Harrington? What does this say about the justice system in Fulton County? Annalise Hayes raised a hand, and an almost magical silence fell over the scrum of reporters. All eyes turned to her. She was in her element now, not just as a lawyer, but as a public figure shaping a narrative. My son will make a brief statement, she announced, her voice calm and authoritative. After which, my colleague Mr. Thorne and I will answer a few of your questions. We will be holding a full press conference tomorrow morning at our offices. She stepped back, leaving Jamal at the center of the storm. For a moment, he was just a 17-year-old boy again, blinking in the bright lights, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He felt his mother's reassuring hand on his back, a silent transfer of strength. He looked past the cameras and saw the faces of other families leaving other courtrooms, mostly black and brown faces, etched with worry and weariness. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He stepped up to the microphones. My name is Jamal Hayes, he began, his voice steady, carrying the same quiet authority it had held inside. A little over an hour ago, I was a statistic. I was a black teenager in a courtroom, and the judge laughed at me. He didn't see a student, an honor roll kid who organizes food drives and wants to be a lawyer. He saw a stereotype. He saw a criminal. A hush fell over the reporters. They lowered their cameras, listening intently. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a testimony. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about me, Jamal continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. It's about every person who walks into a courthouse and is judged not by the facts of their case, but by the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or how much money they have. The system isn't broken. For many people, it's working exactly as it was designed to. It's designed to be intimidating. It's designed to make you feel powerless. He paused, letting his words sink in. I was lucky. I have parents who are brilliant lawyers. I have resources. But what about the kids who don't? The ones who get a public defender for 15 minutes and are told to plead guilty because no one will believe them? Who speaks for them? He looked directly into the lens of the nearest television camera, as if speaking to thousands of people sitting in their living rooms. The law should be a shield that protects everyone equally, but too often, it's a sword used against the vulnerable. Today, I was able to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, just for a moment. But we need to do more than just win one battle. We need to change the rules of the whole system. His statement was clear, powerful, and profoundly resonant. He hadn't just won his case. He had framed it as a universal struggle for justice. He had taken his personal humiliation and transformed it into a public cause. As Marcus Thorne and Annalise Hayes stepped forward to field the technical legal questions, Jamal stepped back. His part in the public spectacle was done, for now. He saw Mr. Chen standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the press conference with an expression of wonder. Their eyes met, and Jamal gave him a slight, respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that they had been on the same side, even if only one of them had known how to fight. Later that evening, The Hayes family home, a modern, art-filled house in Annesley Park, was a strange mix of celebration and strategy session. The air buzzed with the constant pinging of phones and the glow of news alerts on a tablet. The story was the lead item on every national news network. The headline on the AJC website read, "Teen Defendant Lectures, Judge on Law, Forces Dismissal and Recusal in Stunning Courtroom Reversal." The article included a link to the audio recording, which had already gone viral. Judge Harrington's mocking laughter was now echoing across the internet, a meme of judicial arrogance. Judge Laughs was trending on Twitter. Annalise, Marcus, and a small team of lawyers from their firm were gathered around the large kitchen island, which was covered in laptops and legal pads. They were mapping out their next steps: the final draft of the JQC complaint, the civil rights lawsuit against the APD, and a plan to establish a pro bono legal fund for juvenile defendants in Fulton County. Jamal sat slightly apart from them, watching. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing a story about someone else. His mother brought him a glass of water, sitting down beside him. "It's a lot, I know," she said softly. "I knew it would be big," Jamal admitted. "But I didn't know it would be like this. That sound, the judge's laugh. People are sharing it everywhere." "Good," Annalise said, her voice steely. "Let them share it. Let everyone hear what indifference sounds like. Let them hear what prejudice sounds like when it thinks no one is listening." Marcus joined them, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "What you did today, Jamal, was more than just win a case. You created a moment of perfect clarity. You forced people to see the system for what it is. An act like that has consequences." As if on cue, Annalise's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID, and her eyebrows shot up. "It's the Chief Judge of the Superior Court," she said, her voice low. She put the call on speaker. "Annalise," a grim voice said without preamble. "It's Judge Peterson." "Robert," she replied coolly. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Don't play coy," the Chief Judge sighed. "I've spent the entire afternoon in damage control. The governor called me. The mayor called me. The entire Fulton County judiciary is under a microscope because of what Arthur Harrington did today. He's been suspended, pending the JQC investigation. Unofficially, his career is over. He's disgraced." The news was swift and decisive. The system was already cutting out the cancer to save itself. "That's a start," Marcus said into the phone. I know. Judge Peterson sounded weary. "Look, what I'm calling to say is, we're listening. What your son exposed is a deep wound. We're announcing a full-scale review of juvenile court procedures and implicit bias training for all judges, effective immediately. I want to invite Jamal to speak to the panel, to tell his story, to help us fix this." Jamal looked at his parents, his eyes wide. This was it. The ripple effect. It wasn't just about punishing one bad judge. It was about forcing the institution itself to change. He had their attention. He had reclaimed his power, not just for himself, but for countless others. He leaned toward the phone. "I'll be there, Judge Peterson," he said, his voice clear and strong. "But I'm not just coming to talk. I'm coming with a list of demands." The days that followed were a whirlwind. The story of Judge Harrington's downfall was a national sensation, a perfect storm of social media outrage and mainstream news coverage. The audio of his laughter became a symbol of systemic arrogance, played on a loop on cable news. Photos of Jamal, poised and articulate at the courthouse steps, were juxtaposed with the scowling, disgraced image of the judge. It was a David and Goliath story for the modern age, and the public was enthralled. For Judge Arthur Harrington, the reckoning was swift and brutal. His suspension was just the beginning. The Judicial Qualifications Commission, under intense public pressure, fast-tracked its investigation. The sworn affidavit from the law clerk, combined with the viral audio, was irrefutable. Colleagues he had known for decades suddenly stopped returning his calls. The country club he'd belonged to his entire life quietly suggested he suspend his membership to avoid unnecessary distractions. His portrait was discreetly removed from the courthouse lobby. He became a pariah overnight, his name synonymous with judicial misconduct. Within a week, facing certain removal by the JQC, Harrington tendered his resignation. His letter spoke of a desire to spend more time with his family and the increasingly politicized nature of the judiciary. But no one was fooled. It was the final, pathetic act of a man who had lost everything. He retreated into the seclusion of his family's old money estate in Buckhead, a self-imposed exile from the world that had once revered him. The legal consequences were clear. His career was over. But the social consequences were, perhaps, even more severe. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the hushed corridors of power he once roamed as a king. The consequences for Officer Daniel Miller of the APD were just as significant. The civil rights lawsuit filed by Jamal Hayes and Marcus Thorne was a masterwork of legal aggression. It named not only Miller, but also the city of Atlanta, citing a pattern of insufficient training, racial bias, and a failure to discipline officers with repeated complaints. The internal affairs investigation, which might have once been a slow-moving, toothless process, was now under a public microscope. Miller's body camera footage from the protest, which Ms. Davies had initially claimed was inconclusive, was leaked to the press. It clearly showed Jamal acting as a peacemaker, shielding the other student, just as he had claimed. The footage contradicted every line of Miller's official report. Officer Miller was suspended without pay and ultimately fired. The city, facing a PR nightmare and an unwinnable lawsuit, quickly moved to settle with the Hayes family. Annalise and Marcus announced that the entirety of the substantial settlement would be used as the seed money for the new Jamal Hayes Juvenile Justice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing top-tier legal representation for underprivileged youth in Atlanta. The system that had tried to extract a price from Jamal was now being forced to fund its own correction. Meanwhile, Jamal stepped fully into his new role as an agent of change. His meeting with Chief Judge Peterson and the Judicial Review Panel was not a quiet, closed-door affair. At his insistence, it was open to the press and community leaders. He didn't arrive alone. He was flanked by Mr. Chen, who, emboldened by the events, had begun organizing other public defenders to demand better resources, and a dozen other teenagers who had their own stories of being mistreated in the juvenile system. Jamal stood before the panel of sober-faced judges, not as a victim, but as an expert. He presented his list of demands, which was, in fact, a meticulously researched 10-point plan for reform. It included mandatory, ongoing implicit bias and de-escalation training for all judges and bailiffs, the establishment of a civilian oversight committee for the juvenile courts, a policy ensuring that body camera footage is made immediately available to a minor defendant's counsel, and increased funding for the public defender's office. He spoke with passion and precision, backing up every proposal with data, legal precedent, and the powerful personal stories of the teens standing behind him. He wasn't just a symbol anymore, he was a leader. The judges, chastened and humbled by the scandal, listened. They had no choice. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict, and they knew that cosmetic changes would not be enough. They agreed to form a working group, co-chaired by Jamal himself, to implement the reforms. The ripples of that day in Courtroom 4B were becoming a wave of institutional change. 3 months later, the Fulton County Superior Court felt like a different place. The air, while still smelling of old paper, seemed a little lighter. New posters dotted the walls, outlining the rights of juvenile defendants in clear, simple language. A new energy buzzed through the hallways. Jamal walked down the corridor, not as a defendant in a borrowed blazer, but as himself, dressed in a sharp suit, a leather portfolio under his arm. He was on his way to the first official meeting of the Juvenile Justice Reform Working Group. As he passed Courtroom 4B, he paused. The door was ajar. Peeking inside, he saw a new judge on the bench, a young black woman, her expression serious and attentive. A new nameplate read, Judge Michelle Franklin. The change was more than symbolic. It was tangible. He continued down the hall, where Mr. Chen was waiting for him outside the conference room. The public defender looked like a new man. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a fire. He was no longer just processing cases. He was fighting them. He and Jamal had become unlikely allies, working together to draft policy proposals. Ready to go give them hell, Jamal? Mr. Chen asked with a grin. Ready to go give them hope, Mr. Chen, Jamal corrected gently. As they entered the conference room, they were met by the sight of Chief Judge Peterson, several other judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and community activists, all sitting at the same table. It was a room full of people who, just a few months ago, would never have shared the same space as equals. Now, they were here to work, to argue, to compromise, and to build something better. The meeting began, and Jamal, the youngest person in the room by 2 decades, took the lead. He spoke with the confidence of a seasoned advocate, laying out the agenda, fielding questions, and steering the conversation. He had found his voice, not just in defiance, but in construction. He was no longer just tearing down a corrupt system. He was helping to build a new one. The ripples of his actions had spread further than he could have imagined. Law schools across the country were now using the transcript and audio from his hearing as a case study in judicial ethics and defendant advocacy. Applications to the public defender's office in Fulton County had surged. The Jamal Hayes Juvenile Justice Foundation had already taken on its first 10 cases, with Annalise Hayes and Marcus Thorne personally supervising the volunteer attorneys from their firm. The story had become a cultural touchstone, a reference point in the ongoing conversation about race and justice in America. But for Jamal, the victory wasn't in the headlines or the viral fame. It was here, in this drab conference room, in the hard, unglamorous work of changing policies and procedures. It was in the text message he'd received last week from a kid he'd never met. I was in court today, and I thought of you. I wasn't scared to speak up. Thank you. After the meeting, as Jamal walked out of the courthouse into the crisp autumn air, he saw a family, a mother, and her teenage son, looking nervous, about to go inside. The boy looked a lot like him. He met Jamal's eyes for a fleeting second, a flicker of fear and uncertainty in his gaze. Jamal smiled at him. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was everything. It was a smile of solidarity, of encouragement. It was a promise that the hallways inside were a little fairer, the ears inside a little more open, and the chance for justice a little bit greater than it had been before. The echo of a judge's laugh had been replaced by the quiet, powerful resonance of change. In the end, what began as a moment of profound injustice in a forgotten courtroom became a catalyst for sweeping reform. Jamal Hayes, through his courage and intellect, did more than clear his own name. He exposed the deep-seated biases within the justice system and forced a public reckoning. Judge Harrington's career ended in disgrace, serving as a stark warning about the abuse of power. The changes implemented in Fulton County, from new training protocols to civilian oversight, created a more equitable model for juvenile justice that inspired similar movements across the nation. The Jamal Hayes Foundation continues to provide a voice for the voiceless, ensuring that no child has to stand alone against a system designed to silence them. Thank you for watching. If Jamal's story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content that explores the fight for justice. Share this video to spread the message, and let us know in the comments below. What does real justice look like to you? Your voice matters. Don't ever let anyone tell you it doesn't.